The snow fell in soft, relentless sheets, blanketing the cemetery in pristine white. Abigail Parker stood motionless before two granite markers, her black woolen coat dusted with snowflakes that refused to melt against the cold fabric. The wind whipped strands of golden hair across her face, but she made no move to brush them away. 2 years, 2 winters, 730 mornings of waking to emptiness. She knelt her knees sinking into the snow and placed the last two wildflowers of the season preserved carefully in her Bible on the graves. One for James, her husband, one for Sarah, her daughter. 5 years old when the fever took her, despite everything Abigail knew as a nurse, despite every prayer and remedy. 2 years, she whispered, her breath visible in the frigid air. I have to move forward now. The wedding band on her finger caught the weak winter light, a gold circle that seemed to burn against her skin. She twisted it once, twice, then slowly pulled it off. The indentation remained a phantom reminder of what once was. Abigail placed the ring atop James's headstone, her fingers lingering on the cold metal. I'm not betraying you, she said softly. I'm just living. Rising to her feet, she turned toward the waiting wagon, its driver hunched against the cold. Montana Territory waited miles away. A new place, a new purpose. 6 motherless girls and their father needed someone to cook, to clean. Nothing more. She wouldn't allow herself to hope for more. The journey to Bitterroot Valley took 4 days each mile, putting distance between Abigail and the graves she'd left behind. The Montana landscape unfolded before her in dramatic sweeps of white plains and distant mountains, the winter sky an endless gray canvas above. When the wagon driver pointed to the horizon on the 4th afternoon, Abigail strained to see through the falling snow. Thornton Place, he grunted, used to be the finest ranch in the valley. The homestead emerged from the white haze like a charcoal sketch, a 2-story timber house with a sagging porch, a large barn with one door hanging askew, and several outbuildings nearly buried in drifts. Smoke curled from the chimney in a crooked column, twisting away in the wind. As they approached, Abigail noted signs of neglect everywhere. Broken fence posts, a window patched with canvas, the wood pile dangerously low for midwinter. Whatever prosperity the ranch had once known had clearly faded. The wagon came to a stop in the yard. The driver made no move to help as Abigail gathered her carpet bag and medical kit. Her boots hit the packed snow with a crunch that seemed too loud in the winter silence. A small figure darted from behind the chicken coop, a little girl no more than 5 with tangled blonde hair and a face smudged with dirt. She wore a coat several sizes too large, its sleeves rolled up repeatedly to free her small hands. She stopped abruptly at the sight of Abigail, eyes widening to perfect circles in her thin face. Are you an angel? The child asked, her voice clear and unafraid. Pa said Mama became an angel in the fire. Before Abigail could answer, the front door opened. A tall man stepped onto the porch, broad-shouldered and lean. His face was gaunt beneath an unkempt beard, blue eyes sharp as ice picks beneath a furrowed brow. He wore no coat despite the cold, just a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle and marked with old scars. Emily Tuomo, he called, voice rough as bark. Inside. The child Emily cast one more curious glance at Abigail before scampering up the steps past the man. He descended to the yard, stopping several paces from Abigail. Up close, she could see the shadows beneath his eyes, the lines etched deeply around his mouth. This was a man who had forgotten how to smile. William Thornton, he said without offering his hand. His gaze traveled from her face to her practical boots and back, assessing rather than welcoming. You're the widow from Ohio. Abigail Parker, she confirmed. Most call me Abby. The house is this way. He turned, expecting her to follow. I hired you to cook and clean, not to tell fairy tales. Abigail blinked, caught off guard by his brusqueness. I didn't. Angels, heaven. William didn't look back as he climbed the steps. Emily gets notions. Don't encourage them. Following him inside, Abigail was struck by the contrast between the harsh cold outside and the stifling warmth within. A large stone fireplace dominated the main room, its fire built too high. The air smelled of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and something scorched in the kitchen beyond. Discarded clothing, toys, and books littered every surface. A half-finished meal lay abandoned on the table, bread burned black on one side, a pot of what might have been stew crusted over. 6 pairs of boots in varying sizes were scattered across the floor rather than lined neatly by the door. William noticed her taking inventory of the chaos. The last woman quit after 3 weeks, said the girls were wild as wolves. Children who've lost their mother often act out, Abigail said quietly. It's how they process grief. His jaw tightened. I didn't ask for your observations, Mrs. Parker. Just your service. Miss, she corrected gently. Or Abby. Your room is through there past the pantry. William gestured to a narrow door. Girls sleep in the loft. I'm in the back bedroom. He paused, seeming to search for something else to say. Supper's at 6. The girls eat what's put before them, or they go hungry. Before she could respond, the sound of running feet came from above, followed by a shrill argument. William closed his eyes briefly, a muscle working in his jaw. I'll be in the barn, he said, and was gone, leaving Abigail alone in the wreckage of what had once been a home. The room past the pantry was small, but clean, with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a washstand beneath a tiny window. Someone had made an effort here. The linens were fresh, the floor swept. A lamp sat on the bedside table with matches nearby. It was more consideration than William Thornton had shown since her arrival. Abigail unpacked her few belongings, 2 dresses aside from the ones she wore undergarments, a nightgown, her Bible, and her medical kit. The latter she hesitated over before tucking it into the bottom drawer of the chest. She doubted William Thornton would welcome her skills as a nurse, given his reaction to Emily's innocent question. From above came the continuing sounds of children, footsteps, muffled voices, occasional thumps. Abigail counted in her head. 6 girls. She'd been given their names and ages in the letter: Margaret 12, Hannah 10, Victoria 8, Charlotte 6, Emily 5, and Sophie 4. The youngest had been just a baby when her mother died. Squaring her shoulders, Abigail returned to the main room, rolled up her sleeves, and began to restore order. She started with the kitchen, scrubbing the burnt pot, sweeping the floors, wiping down surfaces thick with grease and dust. She found the pantry half empty, poorly organized, the floor infested with weevils. As she worked, she became aware of being watched. Turning from the stove, she found a slender girl with dark braids standing in the doorway, Alma crossed defensively over her chest. The eldest, Margaret Abigail, guessed from her height and the wariness in her eyes. I don't need help, Abigail said, keeping her voice light, but company is always welcome. The girl didn't move. The others didn't last. Abigail wiped her hands on her apron. The other housekeepers. 3 since Mama died. Margaret's chin lifted slightly. They all said they'd stay, but they lied. I'm sorry to hear that. Are you going to lie too? The directness of the question delivered in such a young voice made Abigail pause. I don't make promises I can't keep, she said finally, but I've come a very long way and I don't give up easily. Margaret studied her, unimpressed. You'll see. She turned to go, then looked back. Don't touch Mama's things. They're not yours. I wouldn't dream of it, Abigail assured her. Alone again, she returned to her cleaning with renewed purpose. By late afternoon, she had restored some semblance of order to the kitchen and main room, disposed of spoiled food, and started a pot of soup with the salvageable vegetables she'd found. She'd managed to clean and restock the pantry, discovering in the process that many staples were running dangerously low. The front door opened, bringing a gust of cold air, and William Thornton snow-dusting his shoulders and beard. He stopped just inside, surveying the transformed space. You've been busy, he observed, his tone giving away nothing. Just getting settled. Abigail nodded toward the pot on the stove. Memo. Soup will be ready soon. Is there bread? Flour's spoiled. I sifted the weevils out of what was left. There's enough for biscuits tonight, but we'll need more soon. She hesitated. I should make a list of what's needed from town. William crossed to the fireplace, adding another log, though the room was already warm enough. Write it down. I go on Thursdays. A high-pitched wail from upstairs interrupted their conversation. William tensed, eyes lifting to the ceiling. Sophie, he said, she has nightmares. Would you like me to, No. The word was sharp as a slap. Margaret handles it. You were hired to cook and clean, Miss Parker. Not to mother my children. The rebuke stung more than it should have. Of course, I didn't mean to overstep. William ran a hand over his face, suddenly looking exhausted. Supper at 6, he repeated, and left the room, his footsteps heavy on the stairs. Abigail lay awake long after the house had gone quiet, listening to the unfamiliar creaks and groans of the old timber structure. The wind had picked up moaning around the eaves and rattling the small window in her room. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled the sound lonely and piercing in the night. Sleep eluded her mind, racing with the day's impressions. William Thornton's coldness, Margaret's challenging stare, little Emily asking if she was an angel, the chaos of a household without a woman's touch for too long, and beneath it all, the undercurrent of grief so familiar it felt like her own. It hung in the air, seeped from the walls, echoed in the silence between William's clipped words. A soft cry broke through her thoughts, then another higher and more desperate. Abigail sat up, straining to hear over the wind. The crying continued, quiet but unmistakable. She slipped from bed, pulling her shawl around her shoulders against the chill. The floorboards were ice against her bare feet as she made her way through the darkened house to the narrow stairs leading to the loft. The crying grew louder as she climbed, accompanied now by hushed voices. At the top, she paused and allowing her eyes to adjust to the dimness. The loft was divided into three small areas by hanging quilts, creating makeshift rooms for the six girls. "Shh, Sophie, please," came a strained whisper. "You'll wake Pa." Abigail moved toward the sound, careful of the creaking boards. Pushing aside a quilt, she found Margaret sitting on a small bed, cradling the youngest girl against her chest. Sophie clutched what appeared to be a scorched piece of fabric, her small body shaking with silent sobs. Margaret looked up, her expression hardening at the sight of Abigail. "We don't need you." "I heard crying," Abigail said softly. "Is she ill?" "Nightmare." Margaret stroked Sophie's hair mechanically. "She has them all the time." In the dim light filtering through the loft window, Abigail could see the exhaustion in Margaret's young face. How many nights had she been the one to comfort her sister? How many times had she been forced to be the mother she was too young to be? "Would you like me to sit with her a while?" Abigail offered. "You could get some sleep." "No." Margaret's arms tightened around Sophie. "I said we don't need you." From the shadows beyond the quilt, a small voice spoke. "Can she tell a story?" Abigail turned to find Emily peering around the fabric divider, her blonde hair a tangled halo in the moonlight. "Emily, go back to bed," Margaret ordered. But Emily crept closer, eyes fixed on Abigail. "The angels in heaven, do they sing all the time? Is that why Mama doesn't visit?" Margaret made a choke sound. "Emily, stop. Pa said—" "It's all right," Abigail said gently, kneeling to Emily's level. "I don't know much about angels, but I believe they watch over the people they love. From heaven, from wherever they are." Abigail smiled sadly. "My little girl Sarah, she would have been about your age now. I like to think she's watching over me too." Emily's eyes widened. "You had a little girl. Where is she?" A lump formed in Abigail's throat. "She died, sweetheart, just like your mama. In a fire. No, from a fever." Abigail glanced at Sophie, still clutching the scorched fabric to her chest. "Is that your mother's?" Margaret answered before Sophie could. "It's her shawl. From that night, Sophie won't let it go." Abigail noticed now that all the girls were awake, Hannah sitting up in her bed, Victoria and Charlotte huddled together in theirs, watching the exchange with solemn eyes. "What's it smell like?" Abigail asked Sophie directly, keeping her voice gentle. The little girl looked up, her tear-stained face startlingly like Emily's. For a moment, Abigail thought she wouldn't answer. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, "Like Mama, and smoke." Abigail nodded, understanding. "My Sarah had a blanket. After she died, I kept it close for a long time. It smelled like her." "Did it help?" This from Hannah, the quiet 10-year-old. "Sometimes," Abigail admitted, "but what helped most was talking about her, remembering her." Margaret's face hardened again. "Pa doesn't like us talking about Mama. He says it makes it worse." "Everyone grieves differently," Abigail said, careful not to criticize William. "There's no right or a wrong way." "Can you tell us a story?" Emily asked again, climbing onto Sophie's bed. "About the angels." Abigail hesitated, remembering William's warning, but the pleading looks on the younger girls' faces decided her. "How about a different story? One my mother told me when I was afraid at night." She settled on the edge of the bed, and to her surprise, Sophie reached out a small hand and placed it in hers. Margaret watched, suspicious but making no move to stop her. "Once there was a little star who lived in the darkest part of the sky," Abigail began. "She was very small and very alone. and very afraid of the darkness all around her. By the time she finished the tale of the brave little star who learned to shine her own light, Sophie had fallen asleep against Margaret's shoulder, the scorched shawl still clutched in her fist. Emily's eyes drooped, and even Hannah had relaxed against her pillows. Abigail rose quietly. "Try to get some sleep," she told Margaret, who looked torn between gratitude and resentment. "She'll just wake up again," the girl said, but her voice had lost its edge. "If she does, I'll come back," Abigail promised. "You don't have to do everything alone, Margaret." The girl didn't answer, but as Abigail turned to go, Hannah spoke from her bed. "Thank you for the story." It was a small thing that whispered thanks, but it warmed Abigail as she made her way back downstairs. At the bottom step, she nearly collided with a solid form in the darkness. William Thornton stood like a shadow, arms crossed over his chest. How long he had been there, listening, was impossible to tell. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I heard Sophie crying. I told you not to interfere." His voice was low, controlled, but with an undercurrent of anger. "They're children, Mr. Thornton. They needed comfort. They need consistency, rules, not stories about stars and angels in heaven." In the dim light, his features were harsh with disapproval. "Not false hopes," Abigail straightened her spine. "With all due respect, Sin, what they need is to be allowed to grieve their mother, to talk about her, remember her." "You've been here one day," William said coldly. "Don't presume to tell me what my children need." "I know what grief does to a child," Abigail replied, thinking of the months after Sarah's death, her own inability to speak of her daughter. "It festers if it's buried. It doesn't go away because we refuse to name it." For a moment, William was silent, his breathing audible in the quiet house. Then, "I hired you to cook and clean Miss Parker. That is all. If you can't abide by that, you're welcome to leave in the morning." He brushed past her, heading for his room at the back of the house. Abigail remained at the foot of the stairs, her heart pounding with a mixture of indignation and doubt. Perhaps she had overstepped. Perhaps this position would be as short-lived as those of her predecessors. But as she returned to her own cold bed, she thought of Sophie's small hand in hers, of Emily's wide, trusting eyes, of Margaret's exhaustion and Hannah's whispered thanks. No, she decided, pulling the quilt up to her chin. She would not be leaving in the morning. The kitchen was already warm when William entered at dawn, finding Abigail at the stove stirring a pot of oatmeal. Fresh biscuits cooled on the table alongside a jar of preserved peaches she discovered in the back of the pantry. He stopped short, clearly surprised to find her still there. "Good morning, Mr. Thornton," she said, as if their nighttime confrontation had never happened. "Coffee's hot." William crossed to the stove, pouring himself a mug without a word. He drank half of it black before speaking. "You're still here?" "Yes, sir, I am." He studied her over the rim of his cup. "Despite our conversation." "I don't give up easily, as I told Margaret." Abigail turned back to the oatmeal. "Breakfast is almost ready. Should I call the girls?" A ghost of something, perhaps relief, flickered across William's face before it settled back into its habitual grimness. "They know to be down by 6:30. As if on cue, footsteps thundered on the stairs, and Emily burst into the kitchen, still in her nightgown, blonde hair walled around her face. "I smelled biscuits," she announced, then stopped at the sight of Abigail. "You didn't leave?" "No, I didn't," Abigail confirmed, smiling at the child's evident delight. "Emily, get dressed before breakfast," William ordered, "and tell your sisters to hurry." The girl scampered back upstairs, and soon the kitchen filled with the Thornton daughters in various states of readiness. Margaret, fully dressed with her hair neatly braided, helped Sophie with her buttons. Hannah carried a book, her nose still buried in it, as she found her seat. Victoria and Charlotte arrived together, whispering and giggling, until their father's stern look silenced them. Breakfast was a subdued affair, the girls casting curious glances at Abigail between bites. Only Emily seemed unaffected by the tension, chattering about her dreams and the chickens and how many eggs she might find today. "Emily," William said at last, his tone weary rather than angry. "Enough." The little girl fell silent, her smile fading. Abigail saw Hannah reach under the table to squeeze her sister's hand. When the meal was finished, William pushed back his chair. "Margaret, you're responsible for the girls' lessons today. Hannah, help with the dishes. I'll be mending the east fence." With that, he was gone, the door closing firmly behind him. The kitchen seemed to exhale collectively in his absence. "Does he always leave so abruptly?" Abigail asked, collecting the empty plates. Pa doesn't like to sit still, Hannah offered, bringing cups to the wash basin. Not since Mama. Margaret shot her sister a warning look. We have lessons to do. Come on, everyone. The older girls herded the younger ones into the main room, where a small table near the window held slates and books. Abigail watched as Margaret assigned each sister a task reading for Hannah, arithmetic for Victoria, letters for Charlotte, and simple counting for Emily and Sophie. The scene touched something deep in Abigail's heart. These children were raising each other, stepping into roles far beyond their years. Margaret especially carried a burden no 12-year-old should bear. Turning her attention to the dishes, Abigail found herself suddenly overwhelmed by the enormity of the task before her. Not just the cleaning and cooking, but the healing of this fractured family. If William Thornton would even allow her to try them. The day passed in a blur of chores. After the dishes, Abigail tackled the girls' clothing, finding most items torn or outgrown. She spent the afternoon at the treadle sewing machine in the corner of the main room, altering dresses and mending stockings, while the girls completed their lessons under Margaret's supervision. Victoria, the 8-year-old with a serious face and artistic hands, brought her a torn doll to fix. Her name is Flora, she explained solemnly. Mama made her. Abigail stitched the doll's arm back to its cloth body with careful tiny stitches. Your mother sewed? Victoria nodded. She made all our dresses and quilts and Pa's shirts. Her small fingers traced the doll's faded face. She was making Sophie a doll when she trailed off and Abigail didn't press. Well, Flora is good as new now, she said, handing the doll back. Your mother did beautiful work. You're not supposed to talk about her, Victoria whispered, glancing toward the door as if William might materialize at any moment. Pa gets sad. I understand, Abigail smiled gently. Thank you for trusting me with Flora. As she returned to her mending, Abigail found herself increasingly curious about Rebecca Thornton, the woman whose absence defined this household. What had she been like? How had she died? The brief mention of a fire and Emily's innocent question was the only clue she had. Later, while preparing supper, she discovered a cookbook tucked behind the flour bin, its edges charred as if it had been rescued from flames. Opening it carefully, she found pages of recipes in a flowing feminine hand, along with notes in the margins about who liked what dish and occasions when they were served. William's favorite for his birthday read a note beside a recipe for apple pie. Margaret asked for this on her 10th birthday, beside a description of cinnamon cake. Tucked between the pages was a loose sheet with a different kind of entry. Martin came today, asking about the box again. I will never give it to him, not after what Father said. William doesn't understand why I won't simply hand it over and be done with it, but some things are worth protecting, even from family. Abigail stared at the cryptic note, wondering who Martin was and what the box might contain. Before she could consider further, the back door opened, bringing a gust of cold air, and William, his face ruddy from the wind. She closed the cookbook quickly, sliding it back into its hiding place. Supper will be ready soon, she said, busying herself at the stove. I hope Stu is all right. William grunted an affirmative, hanging his coat by the door. He crossed to the sink, rolling up his sleeves to wash. In the late afternoon light, Abigail noticed fresh scratches on his forearms, one deep enough to still be bleeding. You're hurt, she said, reaching for a clean cloth. It's nothing. William turned away, but not before she saw him wince. Let me see, she insisted, medical training overriding caution. That cut needs cleaning at least. For a moment she thought he would refuse. Then with obvious reluctance he extended his arm. The cut was ragged, nearly 3 inches long, crusted with dirt and blood. How did this happen? She asked, dampening the cloth. Barbed wire, he muttered. Fence repair. Abigail cleaned the wound with gentle efficiency, aware of his gaze on her face as she worked. This should be properly dressed, she said, pressing the cloth to stop fresh bleeding. I have supplies in my room. It's just a scratch that could fester. She met his eyes steadily. I was a nurse during the war, Mr. Thornton. I've seen men lose limbs from less. Something flickered in his expression, surprise perhaps, or reassessment. A nurse? Yes, in a field hospital in Virginia. She didn't elaborate on the horrors she'd seen there, the amputations performed in unspeakable conditions, the men who died screaming for their mothers. I know a wound that needs attention when I see one. William withdrew his arm, but his tone had lost some of its earlier hostility. Fine, after supper. It was a small victory, but Abigail counted it nonetheless. Supper that evening was rabbit stew, the meat provided by a snare William had set the day before. Abigail had added herbs found in the kitchen garden, long neglected, but still yielding rosemary and thyme beneath the snow. "This tastes like," Charlotte began, then stopped herself looking anxiously at her father. "Like what, Charlotte?" William asked, his voice carefully neutral. The 6-year-old poked at her bowl with her spoon. "Like Mama's," she whispered. "She put herbs in, too." A heavy silence fell over the table. Abigail held her breath, waiting for William's rebuke, but it didn't come. "Yes," he said instead, so quietly she almost missed it. "She did." The meal continued in silence, but a different quality of silence than before. When the bowls were empty, William stood. "Margaret, see to the dishes. Miss Parker, I believe you wanted to look at this." He indicated his injured arm. In her room, Abigail retrieved her medical kit from the drawer where she'd hidden it. William stood awkwardly just inside the door, as if reluctant to venture further into her private space. "Sit, please," she said, gesturing to the chair beside the small table. "I need better light." He complied, rolling up his sleeve again to expose the cut. Abigail worked methodically, cleaning the wound thoroughly, applying a salve and bandaging it with practiced hands. "You're good at this," William observed, watching her tie off the bandage. "I had a lot of practice." She packed her supplies away. "Too much, perhaps." "Is that why you left nursing? Too much practice?" The question surprised her. It was the first time he had expressed any interest in her past. "Partly," she admitted. "After James and Sarah died, I couldn't bear it anymore. Caring for the sick when I couldn't save my own." The words slipped out before she could stop them, revealing more than she'd intended. William's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "The fever," he said. "You mentioned it to Emily." "Scarlet fever." Abigail closed her medical kit with a snap. "It swept through our town 2 winters ago. James caught it first, then Sarah. I was spared somehow, left behind. I know something about being left behind." Their eyes met briefly, a moment of shared understanding passing between them. Then William looked away, clearing his throat. "Thank you for the bandage," he said, standing. "And the stew. It was good." It wasn't quite approval, but it was the closest thing to it she'd received since arriving. Abigail nodded, accepting the awkward gratitude for what it was. After he left, she sat on the edge of her bed, turning the day's events over in her mind. The charred cookbook with its mysterious note. The girls' careful avoidance of their mother's memory in their father's presence. The way William had softened just for a moment at the mention of her own loss. There were secrets in this house buried like embers beneath ash, waiting to spark into flame. You summon. Over the next few days, a tentative routine emerged. Abigail rose before dawn to prepare breakfast. William left for his work around the ranch shortly after, and the girls divided their time between lessons and chores under Margaret's watchful eye. Abigail continued her campaign to restore order to the chaotic household. She scrubbed floors, washed windows, beat rugs in the cold air outside. She sorted through the girls' clothing, making lists of items needed from town. She baked bread and made soup and tried to bring warmth back to a home that had been cold for too long. William remained distant, but the sharp edge of his disapproval seemed to have dulled. He began to linger a bit longer, at meals, occasionally asking the girls about their lessons. Once Abigail caught him listening as Hannah read aloud to her sisters, a look of such naked longing on his face that she had to turn away. The girls, too, began to thaw toward her. Victoria brought more dolls to be mended. Charlotte asked to help with the baking. Emily followed Abigail like a shadow whenever possible, chattering about everything and nothing. Even Sophie, still largely silent, had taken to sitting near Abigail, while she sewed content to be in her presence. Only Margaret maintained her distance, watching Abigail with wary eyes as if expecting betrayal at any moment. On Thursday morning, William prepared to go into town for supplies. Abigail handed him her carefully prepared list, which he folded into his pocket without looking at it. "Is there anything else?" he asked, shrugging into his heavy coat. "The girls need proper winter boots," Abigail said, "and fabric for new dresses. They've outgrown most of what they have." William nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'll see what Miller has at the store." As he turned to go, Abigail remembered something. "Mr. Thornton, who is Martin?" He stopped, body tensing visibly. "Where did you hear that name?" "I found a note," she admitted. "In Rebecca's cookbook. She mentioned someone named Martin asking about a box." William's face hardened. Martin Blackwood is Rebecca's cousin, a disagreeable man who thinks he's entitled to family heirlooms that don't belong to him. He pulled on his gloves with unnecessary force. If he ever comes around here, don't let the girls talk to him alone. The vehemence in his voice startled her. Is he dangerous? Just greedy. William settled his hat on his head and willing to use the girls' grief to get what he wants. He tried to convince them their mother would have wanted him to have certain items, upset them badly. I understand, Abigail said, though she felt there was more to the story than William was sharing. I'll keep an eye out. After he left, Abigail returned to the kitchen to find Margaret standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. Were you talking about Uncle Martin? The girl asked. Your father mentioned him, yes. Abigail began kneading dough for the day's bread, giving her hands something to do. He doesn't seem to think highly of him. Margaret's mouth twisted. He's not really our uncle, just Mama's cousin. He comes sometimes asking about Grandpa's things. What things? Old stuff. Boring. Margaret shrugged with forced casualness. Mama didn't like him either. She said he wasn't really her family, even if they had the same blood. The girl turned to go, then paused. You asked Pa about Uncle Martin. Did you? She hesitated. Did you find Mama's journal? Abigail's hands stilled in the dough. No, just a note in her cookbook. Is there a journal? Never mind. Margaret's face closed like a shutter. Forget I said anything. She disappeared before Abigail could press further, leaving her with more questions than answers. That night, the snow that had been threatening all day finally began to fall in earnest. The wind picked up, howling around the eaves and rattling the windows in their frames. By bedtime, a full blizzard was raging outside the world beyond the windows, an impenetrable wall of white. Abigail made her nightly rounds, checking that fires were banked safely and doors secured. The girls had already gone up to the loft, and William was in his room at the back of the house. The storm seemed to have driven everyone to seek the comfort of their beds earlier than usual. In her own small room, Abigail prepared for sleep, braiding her hair and changing into her nightgown. The wind's mournful keening made her think of the wolves she sometimes heard in the distance. Perhaps they were huddled in their dens tonight, waiting out the storm just as she was. She had just extinguished her lamp when a scream pierced the darkness, high, terrified, and unmistakably Sophie's. Abigail was on her feet, instantly fumbling to relight the lamp. By the time she reached the stairs, William was already halfway up them, moving with surprising speed for such a large man. Stay down, he ordered when he saw her. I'll handle it. But another scream followed the first, and then the sound of multiple voices in distress. Ignoring William's command, Abigail followed him up to the loft. The scene that greeted them was one of chaos. Sophie thrashed on her small bed, caught in the grip of a nightmare so powerful that neither Margaret nor Hannah could wake her. Emily cowered in a corner, hands over her ears, while Victoria tried unsuccessfully to comfort her. Charlotte stood frozen in the middle of the room, tears streaming down her face. Sophie! William's voice was sharp with concern as he knelt beside the bed. Wake up, little one, it's just a dream. But Sophie only screamed louder, her small body arching as if in pain. Fire, she shrieked. Mama! Fire! William went pale, his hands hovering helplessly above his daughter. She's not waking up. Abigail moved to the other side of the bed, speaking in the calm, firm voice she'd used with delirious soldiers. Sophie, listen to my voice. You're safe. There's no fire. You're in your bed with your sisters and your pa. She placed a cool hand on the child's forehead, checking for fever, but found only the clamminess of terror. Sophie, open your eyes, look at me. Whether it was her tone or her touch, something reached through the nightmare. Sophie's eyes flew open, wild and unseeing at first, then gradually focusing on Abigail's face. The fire, she whimpered. Mama was in the fire. There's no fire now, Abigail soothed, stroking the damp hair from Sophie's forehead. Just the snow, see, look out the window at all the snow. Sophie turned her head to the loft window where snow pelted against the glass. Her breathing began to slow, the terror receding from her eyes. Snow, she repeated. Cold. That's right, cold and safe. Abigail continued her gentle stroking, aware of William watching her with an unreadable expression. Would you like a drink of water? The little girl nodded, and Margaret quickly fetched a cup from the nightstand. Sophie drank greedily, then looked around at the concerned faces surrounding her bed. I saw it again, she whispered, her voice small and broken. Mama in the fire. William made a pained sound. It was just a dream, Sophie. You weren't there when it happened. You couldn't have seen. But Sophie shook her head stubbornly. I was there. I saw. An uncomfortable silence fell over the loft. Abigail looked between Sophie and William, sensing something significant in their exchange, but unable to decipher it. Emily broke the tension, creeping from her corner to climb onto Sophie's bed. I have bad dreams too, she confided, about angels with burning wings. Emily, William said, his voice strained. That's enough. Abigail could see that all the girls were still too agitated for sleep. The storm continued to rage outside, its ferocity a mirror to the emotional tempest within the loft. Perhaps we should all go downstairs for a while, she suggested. I could make hot milk with honey. Sometimes it helps after a nightmare. William looked like he might object, but Charlotte's eager, yes, please, and Victoria's hopeful expression swayed him. Just for a little while, he conceded. Then back to bed. This kitchen was soon full of nightgown-clad girls huddled around the table while Abigail heated milk on the stove. William built up the fire, casting long shadows that danced on the walls like living things. Sophie sat on Margaret's lap, still trembling, occasionally, but calmer now. Hannah had brought a book down with her. She seemed never to be without one, and was reading quietly to herself. Victoria and Charlotte whispered together while Emily watched the shadows on the wall with fascinated eyes. Abigail added honey to the warm milk, then ladled it into cups for each girl. As she handed Sophie hers, she noticed the child was clutching her mother's scorched shawl, again fingers working the fabric in a constant, nervous motion. Would you like me to wash that for you? Abigail asked gently. It might smell nicer afterward. Sophie's fingers stilled. No, she said the single word firm and clear. It has to smell like Mama. And the smoke. Sophie, William began, his tone warning. Why does it have to smell like smoke, Sophie? Abigail asked, ignoring William's look of disapproval. The little girl glanced at her father, then back at Abigail. So I remember, she whispered. So I don't forget what happened to Mama. William stood abruptly, moving to the window to stare out at the swirling snow. His back was rigid, hands clenched at his sides. Margaret hugged Sophie closer. You don't need to remember, she said fiercely. You were too little. But I saw, Sophie insisted, I saw Mama in the fire. That's impossible, William said without turning around. His voice was tight with suppressed emotion. You were asleep in your cradle. I found you there afterward. William, Abigail said softly, children often create memories from things they've been told. Sophie may believe she remembers because she's heard the story so many times. He didn't respond, continuing to stare out at the storm as if it held answers he desperately needed. Hannah looked up from her book. Mama was in the kitchen when it started, she said quietly. Sophie was with her. Victoria and I were upstairs. Hannah, Margaret hissed. Stop it. But Hannah continued, her voice taking on a strange, detached quality. The lamp fell over. That's what Pa said. The lamp in the kitchen fell, and the oil caught fire. Mama got Sophie out of her cradle, but then the roof beam fell. She closed her book carefully. That's why we couldn't have an open casket, because of the burns. Enough. William's voice cracked like a whip. All of you back to bed. Now. The girls scrambled to obey, all except Margaret, who lingered in the doorway with Sophie in her arms. We're sorry, Pa, she said, her voice small. We didn't mean to upset you. William's shoulders slumped. Without turning, he said, It's all right, Maggie. Just take your sister to bed. When they were gone, Abigail remained at the table, uncertain whether to leave William to his thoughts or offer comfort. The decision was made for her when he finally turned from the window, his face haggard in the firelight. I wasn't here, he said, the words seeming to be torn from him. When the fire started, I was in town picking up supplies. He sank into a chair, staring at his hands. If I had been here... You can't know that you could have saved her, Abigail said gently. No. William raised his eyes to hers, filled with a grief so raw it took her breath away. But I wouldn't have had to live with the knowledge that my children watched their mother burn. The starkness of the statement hung in the air between them. Abigail thought of Sophie's nightmares, of Emily's questions about angels with burning wings, of Hannah's detached recitation of the tragedy. They need to talk about it, she said at last. Keeping it bottled inside only makes the nightmares worse. William shook his head. What good does it do reliving it over and over? It's not about reliving it. It's about processing it, making sense of something senseless. Abigail hesitated, then added, when Sarah died, I couldn't bear to speak her name. I packed away her toys, her clothes, as if by hiding them, I could hide my grief. But it didn't work. It just festered. And now to speaking of her help, yes, Abigail said simply. It hurts, but it's a clean hurt, like lancing a wound to let the poison out. William considered this, his fingers tracing patterns on the wooden table. Rebecca was everything to them. To me. His voice was low, almost a whisper. When she died, it felt like the sun had gone out. I didn't know how to be a father without her being a mother. You've done the best you could. Have I? His laugh was hollow. Look at them. Margaret playing mother when she should be a child. Hannah hiding in her books. Victoria and Charlotte growing up without guidance. Emily making up stories about angels because I can't give her the truth. And Sophie, he trailed off, shaking his head. Sophie, who will never remember her mother except as a figure in flames. Impulsively, Abigail reached across the table and placed her hand over his. They are alive, William. They are loved. In the face of such loss, that is no small thing. He stared at their hands for a long moment, then slowly withdrew his. It's late, he said, rising from the chair. The storm's passing. We should try to sleep. Abigail nodded, recognizing the retreat for what it was. Good night, Mr. Thornton. William, he corrected, pausing at the doorway. You should call me William. It was a small concession, but in that moment it felt like a significant one. Good night, William, she amended. He nodded once, then disappeared into the darkness of the house, leaving Abigail alone with the dying fire and the echo of stories too painful to be told in full. Outside, the storm began to abate, the wind's howl softening to a whisper. But within the walls of the Thornton home, another kind of storm was just beginning to break. The morning after the storm dawned clear and brilliant, the world transformed into a glittering expanse of white. Sunlight bounced off the snow in blinding flashes, turning ordinary fence posts and tree branches into crystalline sculptures. Abigail stood at the kitchen window, watching the display while the coffee brewed. The conversation with William lingered in her mind, his raw admission of failure, the brief moment when his defenses had lowered. She wondered if morning light would restore the walls between them, or if something had fundamentally shifted. The sound of boots on the porch answered her question. William entered, bringing a gust of cold air and the scent of pine and horses. He'd been out since before dawn, checking on the livestock after the blizzard. Morning, he said, stomping snow from his boots. His tone was neutral, giving nothing away. Coffee's hot, Abigail offered. Breakfast soon. He nodded, crossing to the stove to pour himself a cup. They worked around each other in the small kitchen, Abigail mixing biscuit dough, William retrieving cups and plates from the cupboard with the careful choreography of strangers sharing space. The walls were back up then. Abigail tried to ignore the twinge of disappointment. About last night, William said abruptly, his back to her as he stared out the window. The girl's nightmares. They've been worse lately. Abigail kept her voice casual, sensing his discomfort. It's not unusual for grief to resurface in cycles, especially at around anniversaries. William turned surprise evident in his face. How did you know? Know what? That it's nearly the anniversary. He set his coffee down. Rebecca died 1 year ago next week, February 15th. Abigail hadn't known, but the timing made sense. Children sense these things even when they're not explicitly told. Their bodies remember. William absorbed this, a muscle working in his jaw. I've been dreading it, he admitted. I don't know how to mark it, acknowledge it. What would Rebecca have wanted? The question seemed to catch him off guard. He looked away out the window again, where the sun continued its relentless illumination of the snow-covered landscape. She loves celebrations, he said finally. Birthdays, Christmas harvest, festivals. Any excuse to gather everyone together. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. She'd have hated how quiet this house has become. Then perhaps that's your answer, Abigail suggested. Not a somber remembrance, but a celebration of her life. William considered this, his expression thoughtful. Before he could respond, the thunder of footsteps on the stairs announced the arrival of the girls, and the moment of connection was lost again. Zag. After breakfast, the day settled into its usual rhythm. William went out to continue assessing damage from the storm. The girls divided their time between lessons and chores, with Margaret overseeing her sister's work with a seriousness that made Abigail's heart ache. While hanging laundry to dry near the kitchen fireplace, the air outside too cold for wet clothes, Abigail became aware of being watched. Hannah stood in the doorway, a book clutched to her chest like a shield. "Can I help you with something?" "Hannah," Abigail asked, smiling at the solemn 10-year-old. Hannah glanced over her shoulder as if checking that no one else was nearby, then approached. "I want to show you something," she said in a low voice, extending the book. It wasn't a book at all, Abigail realized, but a leather-bound journal. The cover was worn, the pages rippled, as if they'd been wet and dried again. A name was stamped on the front in faded gold letters, Rebecca Thornton. "Your mother's journal," Abigail said, making no move to take it. "Hannah, I'm not sure your father would approve." "You need to see it," Hannah insisted. "Margaret doesn't want me to show you, but I think Mama would have wanted you to know." The intensity in the child's gaze convinced Abigail. She dried her hands on her apron and accepted the journal. "What am I looking for?" "The last entries." Hannah's voice dropped even lower. "About Uncle Martin." Abigail hesitated, torn between respecting Rebecca's privacy and the urgency in Hannah's manner. "Are you sure, Hannah, these were your mother's private thoughts?" "She'd want you to know," Hannah repeated. "You're trying to help us. She'd have seen that." With a small nod, Abigail opened the journal to the ribbon marker near the end. Rebecca's handwriting flowed across the page in an elegant script, the words pressed deeply into the paper, as if written in haste or strong emotion. February 2nd, Martin came again today, more insistent than ever about Father's box. I refused, of course. The map inside belongs to the girls, their inheritance from Grandfather. Martin claimed Father promised it to him before he died, but I know that's a lie. Father never trusted Martin, warned me about him on his deathbed. He's grown more desperate since the rumors about gold in the northern hills. I fear what he might do. William tells me to simply give him the box, to be rid of him, that no old map is worth this strife. But he doesn't understand. It's not just a map, it's proof of ownership. Without it, Martin could claim Grandfather's land as his own. I've hidden the box where no one will think to look. Not even William knows where. Better that way in case Martin tries to pressure him. Abigail looked up from the page, meeting Hannah's watchful gaze. "Your mother was protecting something valuable from your Uncle Martin." Hannah nodded. "The box has Grandpa's map to the mine. Uncle Martin wants it because there's gold there, but Mama said it belongs to us, to me and my sisters." "A mine?" Abigail's brow furrowed. "Your family owns a mine." "Grandpa did, but it got flooded and everyone thought the gold was gone. But now there are stories about more gold up in those hills, and Uncle Martin wants to claim it's all his." Hannah's small face hardened. "He's a liar. Mama said so." Abigail turned back to the journal, scanning the next entry. February 10th. Martin was waiting when I returned from town today. He seemed different, calmer, almost apologetic. "Offered to buy the box outright, a fair price," he said. When I refused again, I saw something change in his eyes. Cold, calculating. He said, "You'll regret this, Rebecca. Some things are worth more than family loyalty." I'm frightened, though I hate to admit it. I've moved the box again somewhere safer. Tomorrow I'll speak to Sheriff Davis, see if he can warn Martin to stay away. The next entry was dated February 14th, the day before the fire. "William leaves for town tomorrow morning. I've decided to show him where the box is hidden once he returns. This burden shouldn't be mine alone, especially with Martin's threats. The girls deserve their inheritance, but not at the cost of peace in this house. I had that dream again last night, the one with the golden-haired woman. She was in our kitchen, baking bread. The girls gathered it around her. In the dream, I knew she would care for them when I could not. William would say, 'I'm being fanciful, seeing portents where there are none, but I can't shake the feeling that the dream means something. If anything should happen to me.'" The entry ended abruptly, the rest of the page blank. Abigail stared at the unfinished sentence, a chill running down her spine despite the kitchen's warmth. "She died the next day," Hannah said quietly. "In the fire." Abigail closed the journal carefully. "Hannah, has your father read this?" The girl shook her head. "He packed all Mama's things away after the funeral. Couldn't bear to look at them," he said. "Margaret found the journal when she was cleaning last summer, but she hid it from Pa. She thought it would make him too sad." "And Martin? Has he been back since your mother died?" "Once, right after the funeral. Pa sent him away. Hannah glanced toward the window nervously. But I saw him in town last week watching our wagon. I think he's still looking for the box. Abigail handed the journal back to Hannah, her mind racing. Does your father know about the gold mine about the map? I don't think so. Mama said it was better if fewer people knew because of how greedy people get around gold. Hannah clutched the journal to her chest again. Are you going to tell him? The question gave Abigail pause. She had no right to keep secrets from William about his own family, yet the journal entries raised troubling possibilities. If Martin Blackwood had threatened Rebecca over this box and its contents, could he have had something to do with the fire that killed her? I need to think about it, she said finally. Thank you for trusting me with this, Hannah. Please keep the journal safe. After Hannah left, Abigail returned to hanging laundry, her movements mechanical as her thoughts churned. Rebecca's final journal entry haunted her, the unfinished sentence, the premonition of doom. And the dream about a golden-haired woman caring for the girls when she could not. Abigail touched her own fair hair, a shiver passing through her that had nothing to do with the winter cold. The day William went to town for supplies, Abigail took the opportunity to search for the mysterious box. It was a betrayal of his trust, perhaps, but her concern for the girls and the troubling implications of Rebecca's journal overrode her scruples. She enlisted the older girls in a thorough cleaning of the house, assigning each area that needed attention. This gave her legitimate reason to examine every corner, every cupboard, every loose floorboard where a small box might be hidden. By mid-afternoon, she had found nothing suspicious. The house, while large, had few hiding places she hadn't already explored in her cleaning over the past week. Whatever secret location Rebecca had chosen, it was well concealed indeed. Abigail was checking behind a loose brick in the parlor fireplace when Victoria appeared at her elbow, making her start. What are you looking for? The 8-year-old asked, her dark eyes curious. Just making sure there are no sparks or embers caught where they shouldn't be. Abigail improvised, brushing dust from her hands. Fire safety is important. Victoria nodded solemnly. Because of what happened to Mama. Yeah, Abigail agreed, seizing the opening. Victoria, do you remember the fire? The girl's expression closed, her gaze dropping to the floor. I was upstairs with Hannah. We smelled smoke, and then Pa was carrying us outside. It was so bright and hot. She wrapped her arms around herself. Mama was still inside with Sophie. Was your uncle there, Martin? Victoria's head jerked up, eyes widening. How do you know about Uncle Martin? Your father mentioned him, Abigail said carefully. He doesn't seem to think very highly of him. Mama didn't like him either. She said he had snake eyes. Victoria glanced toward the door, lowering her voice. He came the day of the fire. I saw him from my window talking to Mama in the yard. They were arguing. Abigail's heart quickened. Did you tell your father this? Victoria shook her head emphatically. He doesn't like us to talk about that day. And anyway, Uncle Martin left before the fire started. I saw him right away. You're sure? Yes, it was almost dark, and then Pa left for town, and then later the fire happened. Victoria's lower lip trembled. I don't want to talk about it anymore. Of course, Abigail soothed, regretting her persistence. I'm sorry I asked. Why don't you go help Charlotte with the dusting? When Victoria had gone, Abigail sat back on her heels, processing this new information. If Martin had argued with Rebecca the day of the fire, and if he'd left before William did, it seemed unlikely he could have caused the blaze. And yet the timing of Rebecca's death just after she'd written of Martin's threats and her intention to tell William about the box was too coincidental to ignore. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats in the yard. Moving to the window, she saw William returning from town, the wagon loaded with supplies. She quickly replaced the loose brick and brushed the soot from her skirt, pushing her suspicions aside for the moment. William seemed preoccupied during supper, responding to the girls' chatter with distracted nods. Even Emily's enthusiastic account of finding a frozen frog by the well couldn't draw more than a half smile from him. After the meal, when the girls had gone upstairs for their nightly ablutions, Abigail found him standing by the parlor window, staring out at the darkening sky. Is everything all right? She asked, keeping her distance, sensing his mood. William didn't turn. Victoria Wellington was in town today. The name meant nothing to Abigail. Oh, widow of Henry Wellington the banker, wealthy woman, influential. He spoke tonelessly, still gazing outward. She asked about you. About me, Abigail frowned. Why would she do that? Apparently, news of a new woman at Thornton Ranch travels fast. Now he did turn his expression unreadable in the dim light. She wanted to know if you were a relative or something else. The implication was clear and Abigail felt heat rise to her cheeks. I see. She also mentioned that the school board is looking for a teacher for the spring term. Said you might be more suited to that position than housekeeping. William's jaw tightened. Offered to speak on your behalf. That was thoughtful of her. Abigail chose her words carefully, though I'm quite content with my current position. Are you? William's gaze was direct now, challenging. A educated woman like yourself playing nursemaid to 6 wild girls and their ill-tempered father, is that how you see what I do here? Abigail's own temper flared unexpectedly. Playing nursemaid, William had the grace to look abashed. No, that's not. I just meant that you could do better. Someone with your background, your skills. My skills are being put to good use here. Abigail stepped closer, emboldened by her conviction. These girls need more than cooking and cleaning, William. They need guidance, education, care. And you think I'm not providing those things? I think you're doing the best you can, she said honestly, but you're one man with a ranch to run and your own grief to manage. William turned back to the window, but not before Abigail caught the flash of vulnerability in his eyes. Victoria Wellington also mentioned that people are talking, he said after a moment, about propriety, a single woman living under the same roof as a widower. Ah, Abigail understood now, and she offered herself as a more suitable alternative. William's silence was answer enough. She must be very concerned about your reputation, Abigail observed, unable to keep a hint of dryness from her tone. How charitable of her. To her surprise, William laughed a short, rusty sound as if he'd almost forgotten how. Charitable isn't the word I'd use. He rubbed a hand over his beard. She's had her eye on this property for years. Thinks it would make a fine addition to her holdings. And you with it? The bluntness of the question startled them both. William turned fully from the window regarding Abigail with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. I'm not for sale, he said quietly. Neither is this land. Something passed between them in that moment, a current of understanding or perhaps recognition. Abigail was the first to look away, suddenly aware of how alone they were, how the firelight cast intimate shadows around them. Well, she said, busying herself with straightening an already neat row of books on the shelf, I'm sorry to have caused gossip. Perhaps it would be best if I found lodgings in town. No, Anna. William's response was immediate, almost vehement. That is, there's no need. Let people talk. The girls need you here. The admission cost him, she could tell. His pride warred with his practical nature with the undeniable improvement in his daughter's well-being since Abigail's arrival. If you're sure, she said, giving him room to retract the statement. I am. William cleared his throat. I also spoke with Sheriff Davis while I was in town. Asked about Martin Blackwood. Abigail's pulse quickened. Oh, what did he say? That Martin's been seen around the valley again, asking questions about Rebecca's belongings, whether anything was salvaged from the fire. William's mouth thinned to a grim line. Davis warned him off once, but he's persistent. Do you think he's dangerous? Abigail asked, thinking of Rebecca's journal entries. William considered this, his brow furrowing. Not physically, perhaps, but he's a man obsessed with something he believes is his by right. That kind of obsession can make people unpredictable. Abigail hesitated, then decided to risk the question that had been nagging at her. William, do you know what Martin is looking for? Rebecca's journal mentioned a box, something valuable that belonged to her father. His head snapped up. You've read Rebecca's journal. Hannah showed it to me, Abigail admitted. The last few entries. Rebecca was worried about Martin, about his threats concerning some box with a map inside. A map to a gold mine. William's expression darkened. Thomas Lowry's old claim, flooded years ago, never reopened. Martin always believed there was more gold to be found there. He shook his head. Rebecca's father left everything to her, including the deed to the mine. Martin contested the will, but the courts sided with Rebecca. Did she tell you where the box was hidden? No. William's hands clenched at his sides. She meant to the day after I returned from town. But by then, he trailed off, the rest unnecessary. Abigail pieced together the timeline in her mind. Rebecca had written of her intention to tell William about the box's location when he returned from town on February 15th. But the fire had occurred the night of the 14th when William was away. William, she said slowly, did the sheriff investigate the cause of the fire? His expression closed like a door slamming shut. It was an accident, a kerosene lamp in the kitchen overturned. But if Martin had threatened Rebecca if he was desperate to find this box, it was an accident, William repeated, his voice hardening. Rebecca was often careless with the lamps, especially when she was tired. She'd been up late waiting for me to return from a trip to the North Pasture. Self-recrimination etched lines in his face. If I hadn't been delayed, if I'd come home when I said I would. You can't blame yourself, Abigail said gently. Can't I? William laughed bitterly. I wasn't here when my wife burned to death in our home, when my youngest daughter was trapped with her. Tell me, Miss Parker, where exactly should I place the blame? The formal address stung a deliberate distancing. Abigail recognized his anger for what it was. Grief turned outward because the inward pain was too great to bear. I'm sorry, she said simply. I shouldn't have pressed. William visibly struggled to rein in his emotions. No, it's a natural question, one I've asked myself more times than I can count. He exhaled heavily, but the sheriff found no evidence of foul play. The fire started in the kitchen, spread quickly because of the dry winter air. By the time neighbors saw the smoke and came running, the whole back of the house was engulfed. How did Sophie survive? Abigail asked, remembering the child's nightmares, her insistence that she'd seen her mother in the flames. Rebecca got her out somehow. Neighbors found her in the yard unharmed, except for smoke in her lungs. Rebecca went back in. They tried to stop her, but she was frantic, saying Emily was still inside. William's voice grew hoarse. Emily wasn't inside. She was with Victoria and Hannah at a neighbor's house for a sewing lesson. But Rebecca didn't know that. She went back into the flames. He turned away, shoulders rigid with the effort of maintaining control. Abigail wanted to go to him to offer comfort, but sensed he would reject it in this moment. The anniversary is coming, she said instead. Perhaps we could plan something to honor Rebecca's memory, something the girls could participate in. William nodded without turning. Yes, that would be good. He cleared his throat. I should check on the horses before turning in. Good night, Miss Abigail. After he left, Abigail remained in the parlor, staring into the fire and thinking of another fire 1 year ago that had destroyed so much. She thought of Rebecca's dream about a golden-haired woman caring for her children, of Sophie's insistence that she'd seen her mother in the flames of Martin Blackwood's threatening words. Coincidence, perhaps. Or something darker. Either way, she had a growing sense that Rebecca Thornton's story was not yet finished, and that somehow Abigail herself was meant to be part of its conclusion. The days leading up to the anniversary of Rebecca's death took on a solemn quality. William spent more time than usual away from the house, returning late, with the scent of cold and solitude clinging to him. The girls grew quieter, even Emily's irrepressible chatter subdued. Abigail did what she could to prepare for the day, quietly planning a simple commemoration. With Charlotte's help, she baked Rebecca's favorite apple pie following the recipe from the charred cookbook. Hannah provided a passage from Rebecca's favorite book, Jane Eyre, a choice that made Abigail smile in recognition of a kindred spirit. Victoria drew a portrait of her mother from memory, capturing a laughing woman with dark curls and kind eyes. On the morning of February 15th, Abigail woke before dawn to find William already gone from the house. The girls came down to breakfast in their Sunday-best faces, solemn but composed. Even Sophie seemed to understand the significance of the day, her small hand clutching the ever-present scorched shawl. After the meal, they all bundled up against the winter cold and walked together to the small family cemetery on a rise behind the barn. William was already there, standing beside a simple granite marker. He'd cleared the snow away, revealing Rebecca's name and the dates of her birth and death. The ceremony was brief but meaningful. Hannah read her passage, Victoria placed her drawing against the stone, and Charlotte set a slice of pie on a small plate before the grave. Emily scattered dried flowers she'd saved from the fall, while Margaret stood protective and silent behind Sophie. When it was William's turn, he simply knelt and placed his hand on the cold stone, eyes closed, as if in prayer or communion. The naked grief on his face made Abigail turn away, feeling like an intruder on a private moment. They walked back to the house together, girls holding hands in a chain, William Hess and Abigail bringing up the rear. The silence between them was companionable rather than strained, shared grief creating a temporary bridge. Inside, they gathered in the parlor where Abigail had lit a fire against the winter chill. To her surprise, William cleared his throat and addressed his daughters. "Your mother loves stories," he said, his voice rough but steady. "She'd want us to remember the happy ones today." "Who wants to start?" One by one, the girls shared memories of their mother, how she sang while baking, how she could name every star in the sky, how she let them lick the spoon when she made frosting. Even Sophie, normally so quiet, whispered, "Mama smelled like flowers." William smiled at that, a real smile that transformed his face. "Lavender," he said softly. "She grew it into the garden and dried it to put in her dresser drawers. And she put it under our pillows when we were sick," Margaret added. "She said it helped us have sweet dreams." "I didn't know that," Abigail said, touched by these glimpses of the woman who had loved this family before her. "There's lavender still in the garden," William told her. "Dried up now, but it'll come back in the spring. Rebecca could make anything grow." The afternoon passed in this gentle exchange of memories. Abigail mostly listened, offering occasional questions to draw out more stories, particularly from the younger girls. She noticed William watching her from time to time, a thoughtful expression on his face. As dusk fell, the emotional toll of the day began to show. Sophie fell asleep in Margaret's lap, and Emily's eyelids drooped despite her protests that she wasn't tired. Abigail organized a simple supper of bread, cheese, and cold meat that could be eaten informally in the parlor, allowing the family to remain together. After the younger girls were tucked into bed, Abigail found William on the porch despite the cold. He stood at the railings, staring out at the star-filled sky. "Thank you," he said, without turning as she joined him, "for today, for helping the girls remember her properly." "They needed it," Abigail said. "You all did." William nodded, still gazing upward. "A year," he murmured. "It seems impossible that it's been a year." "Time passes strangely in grief," Abigail agreed. "Some days it feels like yesterday, others like a lifetime ago." They stood in silence for a while, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Abigail was about to suggest going inside when William spoke again. "I received a letter today from Theodore Parker in California." Abigail started at the name. "Parker. He says he's your brother-in-law." William finally turned to look at her. "James Parker's brother." Her heart seemed to stop, then resume at double speed. "Theodore wrote to you why P.T.M. He's been looking for you since you left Ohio, tracked you through postmasters and stagecoach stations all the way to Montana." William's expression was unreadable in the moonlight. "He says he struck gold in the Sierra Nevada. Wants you to join him there." Abigail gripped the porch railing, feeling suddenly unsteady. "Theodore abandoned me after James and Sarah died," she said, the old bitterness rising like bile. "He couldn't even be bothered to attend the funeral. Why would he want me in California now?" "Family," William suggested. "Guilt, perhaps. Or maybe, as he claims, simply concern for your well-being." "Did he send money?" Abigail asked, already knowing the answer. Theodore had always been generous with funds when it suited him, less so with his actual presence. William reached into his pocket and withdrew an envelope. "Train fare to Sacramento. And this." He handed her a smaller envelope. Inside was a photograph, Theodore standing proudly beside a crude wooden sign that read, "Parker Claim." He looked prosperous, well-fed, his beard neatly trimmed, and his clothes of good quality. "He says there's a place for you there," William continued, watching her face. "A fresh start away from reminders." "Away from snow and cold, he means," Abigail said with a hollow laugh. "Theodore always hated winter." She stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile this image of prosperity with the man who had written exactly one letter of condolence after losing his brother and niece, a letter that had spent more words on his own suffering than on hers. "Will you go?" William asked, the question hanging between them like frost. Abigail looked up from the photograph to find him watching her intently, his eyes dark pools in the moonlight. I, I don't know," she admitted. "I haven't thought of Theodore in months." It was true. In the weeks since arriving at the Thornton Ranch, her past life had receded like a tide going out, leaving only the faintest impressions on the shore of her consciousness. The pain was still there. It would always be there, but it no longer defined her every waking moment. "The girls would miss you," William said, his voice carefully neutral. "They've grown attached." "And I to them," Abigail replied softly. "But California," he continued as if she hadn't spoken. "Gold, prosperity, warmth year-round, family." He turned back to the stars. "You'd be a fool not to consider it." Abigail studied his profile, the proud line of his jaw, the stubborn set of his mouth. "Is that what you think I should do, go to California?" William's hands tightened on the railing. "What I think doesn't matter. It matters to me." The admission hung in the air between them, more revealing than she'd intended. William turned to her slowly, his expression a complex mixture of emotions she couldn't fully decipher. Before he could respond, a sound broke the night's stillness, hoofbeats approaching at a gallop. William tensed, hand automatically moving to his belt, where Abigail knew he carried a knife. "Stay here," he ordered, already moving toward the steps. But Abigail followed, drawn by an instinct she couldn't name. The rider came into view, a man on a lathered horse pushing the animal hard despite the treacherous footing on the snow-packed ground. "Thornton," the man shouted as he pulled his mount to a sliding stop in the yard. "Fire in town, Miller's store is gone, and the flames are spreading. Every man's needed." William was already running for the barn. "I'll saddle up. Tell Davis I'm coming." The rider wheeled his horse and galloped back the way he'd come, leaving churned snow and urgency in his wake. Abigail hurried after William into the barn, where he was throwing a saddle on his sturdy bay gelding. "I'll keep the girls safe," she promised. "Don't worry about us." William paused in tightening the cinch to look at her. "I know you will," he said simply, and in those 4 words was a trust that humbled her. He swung up into the saddle, gathered the reins, then hesitated. "Abigail," he began, then seemed to think better of whatever he'd been about to say. "Just be careful. Martin Blackwood was in town today asking questions at the saloon about the ranch. If he comes around, I won't let him near the girls," Abigail assured him. "Go. The town needs you." With a nod, William urged his horse forward, galloping out into the night toward the distant glow that had appeared on the horizon, the town of Bitterroot burning in the winter darkness. Abigail watched until he disappeared from view, then hurried back to the house. Inside, she found Margaret standing at the foot of the stairs, her face pale in the lamplight. "I heard," the girl said. "Fire in town." "Yes, your father's gone to help." Abigail bolted the door, a precaution she wouldn't normally take. "Let's check on your sisters, make sure they're still asleep." They found the younger girls undisturbed, small forms huddled under quilts against the winter cold that seeped through the old timber walls. Even in sleep, Sophie clutched her mother's scorched shawl, the fabric a talisman against nightmares. Back downstairs, Margaret hovered uncertainly by the fire. "Will Pa be all right?" "Of course," Abigail said, with more confidence than she felt. "He's strong and smart, and the whole town will be working together to fight the flames." Margaret nodded, but her worried expression remained. "Fire takes strong men too," she said softly. "It doesn't care who you are." Abigail had no answer for that. Instead, she busied herself banking the fire for the night and checking that all lamps were properly extinguished, a routine she'd established from her first day in the house, born of her own caution in the knowledge of what had happened here. "You should try to sleep," she told Margaret. "Your father might not be back until morning." "I'll stay up with you," the girl insisted. In case Martin comes." Abigail paused in her work, surprised. "You heard that part too." Margaret nodded, her young face serious beyond her years. "He's a bad man. Mama was afraid of him, even though she tried not to show it." "Did you ever see him threaten your mother?" Abigail asked carefully. "Not with a gun or a knife, if that's what you mean, but with words." Margaret wrapped her arms around herself. "He told her once that accidents happen all the time in the mountains, that she should be careful." A chill ran through Abigail that had nothing to do with the winter night. "When was this?" "Last winter, January, I think, after Grandpa's funeral." Margaret's brow furrowed in concentration. "Mama cried after he left. I'd never seen her cry before, not even when Grandpa died." Abigail absorbed this, the implications disturbing. If Martin had made veiled threats against Rebecca, and if he'd been desperate to find the box with the mine deed— "Margaret," she said slowly, "your mother's journal mentioned she hid the box somewhere no one would think to look. Do you have any idea where that might be?" The girl shook her head. "Hannah and I have searched everywhere. Behind bricks in the firelace, under floorboards in the old root cellar. It's not in the house, or we would have found it." "Could it be somewhere else on the property, the barn perhaps, or one of the outbuildings?" Maybe, Margaret conceded, but most of those burned in the fire too. The barn was saved and the spring house, but the tool shed and smokehouse were destroyed. Abigail thought of Sophie's nightmares, her insistence that she'd seen her mother in the flames. An idea began to form, but before she could pursue it, a sound outside made them both freeze, the crunch of footsteps in snow approaching the house. "Puh," Margaret whispered, moving toward the window. "Stay back," Abigail ordered, extinguishing the parlor lamp to prevent whoever was outside from seeing in. She moved cautiously to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. A figure stood in the yard, bulky in a heavy coat, face obscured by the upturned collar and the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. Not William, this man was shorter, stockier. He moved with a furtive air, glancing repeatedly at the darkened windows of the house, as if assessing whether anyone was awake. "Is it him?" Margaret asked, her voice barely audible. "Is it Martin?" "I can't tell," Abigail admitted, "but whoever it is, they're trying not to be seen." The figure moved toward the barn, disappearing inside. Abigail's mind raced. If it was Martin Blackwood, what was he looking for in the barn? The box with the mine deed? Or was he simply stealing a horse, taking advantage of William's absence? "Stay here," she told Margaret, and "lock the door behind me. If I'm not back in 10 minutes, wake Hannah and take your sisters out the back way to the Petersons' farm." "Where are you going?" Margaret's eyes widened in alarm. "To see who our visitor is," Abigail said grimly, reaching for William's spare coat hanging by the door. "And what he wants." "You can't if it's Uncle Martin." "Then I'll finally meet this man who's caused so much fear," Abigail said, buttoning the coat. It was far too large for her, but it would keep out the cold. "I need to know Margaret, for all of you." Before the girl could protest further, Abigail slipped out into the night, the cold air a shock against her face. The moon had risen higher, casting blue-white light over the snow-covered landscape and creating deep shadows between buildings. She moved as quietly as possible across the yard, keeping to those shadows. The barn door stood slightly ajar. A faint glow visible within, the intruder had lit a lantern. Reaching the door, Abigail paused, listening. She could hear movement inside, the rustle of straw, the occasional creak of wood. Taking a deep breath, she peered through the gap. A man stood with his back to her, holding a lantern high as he examined the barn's rough-hewn ceiling beams. He muttered to himself, words she couldn't make out, as he moved from one beam to another. Abigail pushed the door open wider, wincing at the creak of hinges. The man whirled around, and she found herself staring into the face of Martin Blackwood. He was perhaps 50, with a florid complexion and small, sharp eyes set too close together. A scar ran from the corner of his mouth to his jaw, giving him a perpetual half-sneer. He looked nothing like Rebecca, whose portrait Abigail had seen earlier that day. No shared features, no family resemblance to suggest their kinship. "Well," he said, recovering quickly from his surprise. "What have we here? Thornton's new woman, I presume." "Mr. Blackwood," Abigail acknowledged, stepping fully into the barn. She kept her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "This is private property. William isn't here, but I'm sure he'd say the same. You're not welcome." Martin laughed, a harsh sound in the quiet barn. "Bold little thing, aren't you, staking your claim already?" He set the lantern on a barrel, regarding her with undisguised assessment. "You're prettier than Rebecca was, younger too." Abigail ignored the bait. "What are you doing here, Mr. Blackwood?" "Family business," he said smoothly. "Nothing that need concern you, Miss Parker, Abigail Parker." She glanced at the ceiling beams he'd been examining. "What are you looking for?" A flicker of surprise crossed his face before he masked it. "Clever as well as pretty. Thornton's done well for himself." "Mr. Blackwood, whatever grievance you had with Rebecca, it died with her," Abigail said firmly. "I must ask you to leave." Martin's expression hardened. "My grievance, as you call it, isn't so easily dismissed. My uncle left property that rightfully belongs to me, not to Rebecca or her brats." He took a step closer, and Abigail forced herself not to retreat. "I want what's mine. Even if it means terrorizing children who've lost their mother," Abigail challenged. "What kind of man does that make you?" "A practical one," Martin replied, unperturbed by her accusation. "Business is business, Miss Parker, nothing personal." "It seemed personal to Rebecca," Abigail countered. "Personal enough that she feared you, that she wrote about your threats in her journal." This time Martin couldn't hide his reaction. A muscle jumped in his jaw and his eyes narrowed dangerously. You're bluffing. That journal burned with her. Did it? Abigail raised an eyebrow, seizing the advantage. Are you sure about that, Mr. Blackwood? As sure as you are that the fire was an accident? Martin's face darkened. Careful, Miss Parker. That sounds like an accusation. Does it? Abigail maintained her calm facade through sheer force of will. How interesting that your mind went there immediately. For a long moment they regarded each other in silence, the lantern's flame casting dramatic shadows across their faces. Then Martin smiled a cold, humorless expression that didn't reach his eyes. You're playing a dangerous game, he said softly. Rebecca tried to be clever too. Look how that ended. A chill ran down Abigail's spine, but she refused to show fear. Are you threatening me, Mr. Blackwood? Merely offering a friendly warning. He retrieved his lantern. Tell Thornton I'll be back. What I'm looking for doesn't burn. It's here somewhere, and I mean to find it. He brushed past her, pausing at the door. Oh, and Miss Parker, fires are common in these mountains. Tragic accidents. Be careful with those lamps. With that parting shot, he disappeared into the night, leaving Abigail trembling with delayed fear and rage. She waited until she heard the sound of hoofbeats fading into the distance before sagging against a stall door, her knees suddenly weak. The implications of Martin's words were unmistakable. He hadn't explicitly confessed to setting the fire that killed Rebecca, but his veiled threat made his capability for such an act chillingly clear. Abigail looked up at the ceiling, beams Martin had been examining. What had he expected to find there? The box with the mine deed. And why would Rebecca hide something so valuable in a barn exposed to the elements and easily accessible? Unless, a memory surfaced, Sophie clutching her mother's scorched shawl, insisting she'd seen Rebecca in the flames. William saying that neighbors had found Sophie in the yard unharmed except for smoke in her lungs, while Rebecca had gone back into the burning house. What if Rebecca hadn't gone back for Emily, as William believed? What if she'd gone back for the box, and what if she'd given it to Sophie first? The realization hit Abigail with the force of a physical blow. The shawl. Sophie's precious scorched shawl that she refused to let anyone wash or take away. What if the box wasn't hidden in the house or barn at all, but within the folds of that seemingly innocuous piece of fabric? Heart pounding out, Abigail hurried back to the house where Margaret waited anxiously by the door. Was it him? The girl asked as Abigail bolted the door behind her. Yes, Abigail confirmed, shedding William's coat. He's gone now, but he'll be back. Margaret, I need to see Sophie's shawl. Margaret's brow furrowed in confusion. Her shawl, why? I think, Abigail said carefully, that your mother may have hidden what Martin is looking for in the last place anyone would think to look was Sophie herself. Abigail's heart pounded as she and Margaret crept up the stairs to the loft. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of old timbers settling in the winter cold and the faint whistling of wind through gaps in the walls. We shouldn't wake her, Margaret whispered as they reached the top. Sophie has trouble getting back to sleep. I don't want to wake her either, Abigail assured her. Just to check the shawl. They moved carefully across the loft floor, avoiding the boards that groaned underfoot. In the dim moonlight filtering through the small window, Abigail could make out the shapes of the sleeping girls. Victoria and Charlotte shared one bed, Hannah slept alone in another, and Emily and Sophie were curled together in the third, a tangle of small limbs under thick quilts. Sophie lay on her side facing away from Emily, the scorched shawl clutched against her chest even in sleep. One corner of the fabric was visible, protruding from beneath her chin. Abigail knelt beside the bed, studying the sleeping child. How could she examine the shawl without disturbing Sophie? And what exactly was she looking for? A bulge? A hidden pocket? Something sewn into the fabric? As if sensing their presence, Sophie stirred, mumbling something unintelligible. Abigail froze, afraid the child would wake and cry out. But Sophie merely sighed, her grip on the shawl loosening as she rolled onto her back. The movement exposed more of the shawl, and in the moonlight, Abigail noticed something she hadn't seen before, a section where the fabric appeared thicker, with tiny, nearly invisible stitches around the edges. A patch. No more like a hidden pocket. Look, she whispered to Margaret, pointing. See how the fabric is different there. Margaret leaned closer, squinting in the dim light. Mama was always sewing, she said softly. She could make stitches so small you'd never see them unless you knew to look. Carefully, Abigail reached out and touched the thicker section of the shawl. Something solid lay beneath the fabric, small and rectangular. Her pulse quickened. Could it be had Rebecca hidden the box in plain sight, entrusting it to her youngest child? Sophie stirred again, her small face scrunching in displeasure at the disturbance. Abigail withdrew her hand, not wanting to wake her. "We should wait until morning," Margaret said, eyeing her sister anxiously. "I've never seen what's in the shawl. I didn't know there was anything to see." Abigail nodded her agreement. After Martin's visit and veiled threats, she was reluctant to leave the shawl, and whatever it contained, unguarded but disturbing Sophie's sleep, seemed equally unwise. "You're right," she conceded, "but I don't think we should leave Sophie alone tonight, not after Martin's visit." "I'll stay with her," Margaret offered immediately. "No, I think we should all stay together." Abigail made a swift decision. "Help me wake your sisters very gently. We'll all sleep in the parlor tonight where I can keep watch." One by one, they roused the sleepy girls, quieting questions with whispered assurances that everything was fine, just a special night to sleep by the big fireplace. Hannah, always the most perceptive, gave Abigail a searching look, but asked no questions as she helped Charlotte and Victoria gather their quilts. Sophie was the last to wake, blinking owlishly in confusion. "Where's Pa?" she asked, clutching her shawl tighter. "He's helping in town," Abigail explained, lifting the small girl into her arms. "There was a fire and he's being very brave. We're going to have a special sleep by the fire night while we wait for him to come home." Sophie considered this, her gaze direct and solemn in a way that always made Abigail feel the child could see right through pretense. "Is the bad man here?" Abigail's blood ran cold. "What bad man, Sophie?" "The one who hurt Mama." Sophie's voice was matter-of-fact, as if stating something obvious. "The one with the snake eyes." Margaret inhaled sharply. "Sophie, you shouldn't say such things." But Abigail's mind was racing. Snake eyes, the same description Victoria had used for Martin Blackwood. "Did you see the bad man the night of the fire, Sophie?" she asked carefully. Sophie nodded, her small face grave. "He was angry. He pushed Mama." Her fingers worked at the edge of the shawl at the very spot where Abigail had felt the hidden object. "Mama gave me this and said, 'Run.' So I did." Abigail and Margaret exchanged shocked glances. If Sophie was telling the truth, if she had actually witnessed Martin attacking Rebecca the night of the fire, then Rebecca's death was no accident. It was murder. "Sophie, this is very important," Abigail said, keeping her voice gentle despite her racing heart. "Did you tell your pa about the bad man, about what you saw?" Sophie shook her head. "Mama said not to tell. It's a secret." She pressed her finger to her lips. "Shh." "But sweetheart, if the bad man hurt your mama, your pa needs to know," Abigail insisted. "Mama said only tell the golden-haired angel when she comes," Sophie replied with the simple logic of a child. "Are you the angel, Miss Abby?" The question took Abigail's breath away. Rebecca's journal entry flashed through her mind, the dream about a golden-haired woman who would care for the girls when she could not. Had Rebecca somehow foreseen her own death? Had she given Sophie instructions about what to do with the shawl and its contents? "I'm not an angel, Sophie," Abigail said softly, "but I do want to help you and your sisters. And your pa." Sophie seemed to consider this, then nodded once, a decisive gesture oddly adult in such a young child. "Then I can show you," she declared, "in the morning, when it's light." Mama said only in the light. Abigail wanted to press further, but she could see exhaustion overtaking Sophie, her small eyelids drooping despite the gravity of the conversation. "In the morning?" she agreed, carrying the child downstairs to join her sisters. In the parlor, Abigail arranged quilts and pillows on the floor before the fireplace, creating a nest of sorts for the girls. She built up the fire to ward off the winter chill, then settled into the armchair nearby, positioning herself between the makeshift beds and the door. Despite their initial excitement at this impromptu adventure, the girls soon drifted back to sleep, leaving Abigail alone with her tumultuous thoughts. If Sophie had witnessed Martin attacking Rebecca, if the fire had been deliberately set to cover a murder, then everything changed. William needed to know, the sheriff needed to know. But would they believe the testimony of a 4-year-old child? And what of the mysterious object hidden in the shawl? If it was indeed the box containing the deed to Thomas Lowry's mine, it represented both proof of Martin's motive and potentially a significant inheritance for the girls. Abigail's gaze drifted to the window where moonlight illuminated the endless expanse of snow outside. Somewhere out there, William was fighting another fire unaware of the revelations unfolding in his absence. And somewhere else, Martin Blackwood was plotting his next move, perhaps already planning to return for what he believed was his by right. Dawn seemed an eternity away. Shoshiran. William returned as the first gray light of morning seeped through the windows. Abigail, who had dozed fitfully in the armchair, woke at the sound of the door opening. She was on her feet, instantly moving to intercept him before he could wake the girls. He looked exhausted, his face smudged with soot, his clothes reeking of smoke. Fatigue etched deep lines around his eyes, and his movements were slow, heavy with the aftermath of physical exertion. "The town?" Abigail asked quietly, taking his coat. "Half gone," William replied, his voice a rasp. "Miller's store, the assay office, the boarding house. We saved the church and most of the homes." He glanced past her to where his daughter slept in a pile of quilts before the fire. "What's this?" "They're fine," Abigail assured him quickly. "We had a visitor last night. I thought it safer to keep everyone together." William's expression, sharp and fatigued, temporarily forgotten. "Martin?" Abigail nodded. "He was in the barn searching. When I confronted him, he made threats. Veiled, but clear enough." "You confronted him?" William's voice rose slightly before he caught himself glancing at the sleeping girls. "Abigail, the man's dangerous." "So I gathered," she said dryly, "but I needed to know what he wanted." "William, there's something you need to see. Something Sophie has." Briefly, she recounted her discovery of the hidden object in Sophie's shawl and the child's disturbing revelations about the night of the fire. With each word, William's face grew darker, a storm of emotions brewing behind his eyes. "She said Martin was there," he demanded when Abigail finished. "That he pushed Rebecca. She called him the bad man with snake eyes." "But yes," Abigail confirmed, "and she said Rebecca told her to run after giving her the shawl." William turned away, pacing the small space between the door and the parlor entrance. "If this is true," he said, his voice tight with controlled fury, "if Martin killed Rebecca—" "We need proof," Abigail said softly. "Sophie's word alone won't be enough, not against a man like Martin." "The box," William said, stopping his pacing. "If Rebecca hid it in the shawl, if it contains what Martin was looking for, it's proof of motive at least." "Sophie said she would show us in the morning, when it's light." Abigail glanced toward the window where dawn was gradually asserting itself over the darkness. "She said those were Rebecca's instructions, only in the light." William ran a hand over his face, leaving a fresh smudge of soot across his cheek. "Rebecca," he murmured. "Even at the end, she was trying to protect them. To protect the inheritance she knew was rightfully theirs." He looked so broken in that moment, so weighted with grief and newfound rage, that Abigail moved without thinking. She placed her hand on his arm, a small gesture of comfort. "You should rest," she said gently. "The girls will be waking soon, and Sophie needs you calm when she shows us what she's been guarding all this time." William looked down at her hand on his arm, then up to her face. Something shifted in his expression, a softening, a recognition. "You're good with them," he said quietly. "With all of us, better than we deserve." "That's not true," Abigail objected. "You've all been through so much." "As have you," he reminded her. His hand moved to cover hers, calloused fingers warm against her skin. "Yet here you are confronting dangerous men and uncovering year-old secrets, all to protect a family not your own." The moment stretched between them, fragile and charged with unspoken feelings. Abigail was acutely aware of their proximity, of the weariness in his eyes giving way to something else, something that made her heart beat faster. A small voice broke the spell. "Pa, you're home." They turned to find Emily sitting up among the quilts, her blonde hair a tangled halo around her sleep-flushed face. Her cry woke the others, and soon William was surrounded by his daughters, all talking at once, asking about the fire in town and why they were sleeping in the parlor. Only Sophie held back, watching the reunion with solemn eyes, her scorched shawl clutched tightly to her chest. When the initial excitement died down, she approached her father, tugging at his pant leg to get his attention. "Pa," she said firmly when he knelt to her level, "I have to show you something. Mama said it's time." The room quieted, the other girls sensing the gravity in their youngest sister's manner. William glanced at Abigail, who nodded encouragement. "Show me, little one," he said to Sophie, his voice gentle. Sophie looked around at her sisters, then at Abigail. "Everyone has to see," she declared. "Mama said so." With careful ceremony, she laid her shawl on the floor, smoothing it flat. The section that had caught Abigail's attention the night before was clearly visible now in the growing daylight, a rectangle about 4 inches long and 3 inches wide, sewn into the fabric with nearly invisible stitches. Mama sewed it in. Sophie explained to her small fingers tracing the hidden pocket. She said not to tell, not until the golden-haired angel came. She looked up at Abigail. She's here now. William's gaze followed Sophie's to Abigail, a question in his eyes. Abigail shook her head slightly, unable to explain the child's certainty or the eerie echo of Rebecca's journal entry about the woman in her dreams. Sophie continued her solemn narration. The bad man wanted to take it. He was angry. He pushed Mama and she fell. Her voice remained matter-of-fact, but her eyes filled with tears. The lamp broke. There was fire everywhere. Margaret moved to comfort her sister, but Sophie shook her head. I have to finish. Mama said finish it all at once. She took a deep breath. Mama put this in my hands and said run. So I did. I ran outside and hid under the big pine tree. I watched the fire. I waited for Mama. Tears streamed down her face now, but she made no sound. Mama didn't come. The bad man did. He looked for me, but I stayed hidden. Then people came and he went away. They found me after he was gone. William made a choked sound somewhere between a growl and a sob. Sophie, why didn't you tell me all this time? Mama said only tell when the golden-haired angel comes. Sophie repeated, her voice small but insistent. She said the angel would keep us safe. Hannah spoke up, her quiet voice carrying in the hushed room. She dreamed about her pa, about Miss Abby. She wrote it in her journal. William's eyes met Abigail's over the heads of his children, a mix of wonder and grief in his gaze. Before he could speak, Sophie bent over her shawl again, her small fingers working at a hidden seam. This is the special part, she announced. Mama said only open it when everyone is together. With surprising dexterity for one so young, she unpicked the tiny stitches along one edge of the hidden pocket. When the seam was open, she reached inside and withdrew a small object, a box made of polished wood, no bigger than her palm, inlaid with mother-of-pearl in an intricate pattern. Grandpa's box, Margaret breathed, leaning closer. I remember it from when we visited his house. Sophie held it out to William with both hands, a ceremonial offering. Mama said give it to Pa when the time comes. William took the rest with reverent care, turning it over in his hands. There was no visible lock or latch, but when he pressed one of the inlaid designs, a hidden compartment sprang open. Inside lay a folded document, yellow with age, and a small brass key. William unfolded the document carefully, revealing a map drawn in faded ink with annotations in a crabbed masculine hand. At the bottom was an official-looking seal and a signature. The deed to Thomas Lowry's mine, William said softly, and a map showing its location. He traced the lines with a gentle finger. Rebecca's inheritance from her father. The girl's inheritance now. What's the key for? Victoria asked, pointing to the brass key that still lay in the box. I don't know, William admitted. He examined it more closely. It's too small for a door, a padlock perhaps, or a strong box. Hannah, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke. I know what it opens. When everyone turned to look at her, she explained, Grandpa had a secret drawer in his desk. I saw him open it once with a key like that. That's where he kept his journal about the mine. His journal? William's brow furrowed. What journal? About the gold, Hannah said. He mapped where the richest veins were before the lower tunnels flooded. He said it was worth a fortune to anyone who could drain the water. She looked at the box in William's hands. Mama must have taken the key for safekeeping, but the desk is still at Grandpa's house. Uncle Martin lives there now. The implications settled over the room like a physical weight. If Thomas Lowry had mapped the richest gold veins in his flooded mine, and if that information was hidden in a secret drawer that Martin hadn't discovered, that's why he was so desperate to find this box, Abigail realized aloud. Not just for the deed, but for the key that would lead him to the real treasure, the location of the gold. And he killed for it, William said, his voice hard with certainty now. He killed Rebecca for this. He closed the box with a decisive snap. He'll hang for it. But, Margaret said hesitantly, will the sheriff believe us? Believe Sophie? It was a valid question. A child's testimony about events from a year ago with no witnesses except the accused would be difficult to prove in court. We have the map and deed, William said. Proof of motive, and Sophie's account matches what we know about the fire. His jaw set in a determined line. It's enough to start with. Sheriff Davis is no fool. Abigail wasn't so sure, but this wasn't the time for doubts. What will you do, she asked. Ride to town as soon as I've cleaned up. William decided. Martin will know by now that I was there fighting the fire, that the house was less guarded. If Sophie is right about what she saw, he won't hesitate to act again if he thinks the box is within reach. The town is in chaos after the fire, Abigail pointed out. The sheriff will have his hands full. All the more reason to go now before Martin can take advantage of the confusion. William stood wincing slightly at the stiffness in his muscles after the night's exertions. I want all of you to stay together while I'm gone. Don't open the door to anyone. What about Miss Wellington? Emily asked innocently. She said she was coming to visit today, to bring us new dresses. William frowned. Victoria Wellington. When did she tell you this? Yesterday in town, Emily replied. When we were at the store, she said she had pretty dresses that didn't fit her nieces anymore, and she would bring them today. Abigail and William exchanged looks. The timing was suspicious, Victoria Wellington suddenly deciding to visit on the very day William would be away, dealing with the aftermath of the fire. She seemed very interested in when you'd be back from fighting the fire, Pa. Hannah added, her perceptive gaze moving between her father and Abigail. She asked if we would be alone. And what did you tell her? William asked carefully. That Miss Abby would be with us, Hannah said. She didn't look happy about that. William's frown deepened. Miss Wellington will have to wait for another day. No visitors at all until I return. Is that clear? The girls nodded solemnly, even Emily, who looked a bit disappointed at missing the promised dresses. You should eat before you go, Abigail said, practical concerns asserting themselves. And change into clean clothes. You're still covered in soot. William nodded, some of the tension leaving his shoulders at her matter-of-fact tone. Yes, ma'am, he said with the ghost of a smile that didn't reach his eyes. As he headed to his room to clean up, Abigail turned her attention to the girls. Let's get dressed and have breakfast, she said briskly. Then we can tidy up these quilts and restore some order before your father leaves. The familiar routine seemed to comfort them, even as the revelations of the morning hung in the air like smoke. Sophie kept the wooden box close as she dressed, refusing to let it out of her sight now that its secret was revealed. It was as if a burden had been lifted from her small shoulders, the burden of keeping her mother's final secret. Abigail couldn't help but wonder at the strange confluence of events that had brought her to this moment. Rebecca's dream of a golden-haired woman who would care for her children. Sophie's certainty that Abigail was the angel her mother had told her to wait for. The timing of her arrival at the Thornton Ranch just as the anniversary of Rebecca's death approached. Coincidence or something more, some design beyond human understanding. She pushed the unsettling thoughts aside, focusing instead on the practical task at hand. There would be time for reflection later. For now, William needed to reach town safely, and the girls needed the stability of routine in the midst of these new upheavals. As she mixed batter for breakfast biscuits, Abigail was acutely aware of the letter from Theodore Parker, still in her apron pocket where she'd placed it the night before. California seemed a world away now, an alternate life that grew less substantial with each hour she spent in this house with these children. She had told William she didn't know whether she would go, but standing in the kitchen watching Margaret help Sophie wash her hands and Victoria set the table without being asked, Abigail realized she did know. This was where she belonged, where she was needed, where she had against all odds found a new purpose, and perhaps she dared to hope a new love. The only question was whether William Thornton felt the same. No. William left after breakfast, the wooden box secured inside his coat, a rifle across his saddle. He had cleaned up and changed into fresh clothes, but exhaustion still lined his face, a testament to the night spent battling flames in town. Before mounting his horse, he had taken Abigail aside, his voice low and urgent. If I'm not back by nightfall, take the girls and go to the Petersons' farm. Frank Peterson is a good man. He'll shelter you until this is settled. We'll be fine, Abigail assured him, projecting a confidence she didn't entirely feel. The doors are solid, and I know how to use that shotgun over the fireplace. William's expression softened. I don't doubt it. He hesitated, then added, Abigail, when I return, when this is finished, we need to talk. About Theodore's letter. About what happens next. Yes, she agreed, her heart skipping at the intensity in his blue eyes. When you return. He'd nodded once, then turned to say goodbye to his daughters who had lined up on the porch to see him off. Each received a kiss on the forehead and a quiet word. Sophie, last in line, held up her arms to be lifted. You be brave while I'm gone, William had told her, holding her close. You've been the bravest of all, carrying Mama's secret all this time. Mama said you'd keep us safe, Sophie replied with simple faith. You and the angel. William's gaze had shifted to Abigail over Sophie's head, something unspoken passing between them. Then he'd set the child down, mounted his horse, and ridden off toward town, a solitary figure soon swallowed by the vast white landscape. The days stretched long after his departure. Abigail kept the girls busy with chores and lessons, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy, despite the watchful eyes she kept on the approach to the house. They had just finished lunch when the sound of an approaching wagon reached them. Stay inside, Abigail ordered, moving to the window. Through the wavy glass, she could make out a smart buggy pulled by a matched pair of grays, a far cry from the sturdy farm wagons common in the valley. It's Miss Wellington, Hannah confirmed, peering around Abigail's skirt. That's her fancy town buggy. Indeed, as the vehicle drew closer, Abigail could see a woman at the reins dressed in an elegant fur-trimmed cloak. Beside her sat a man whose broad-brimmed hat and stocky build were instantly familiar from the night before. Martin Blackwood. Girls upstairs, Abigail said sharply. All of you, now! But Miss Wellington said she was bringing dresses, Emily protested. Emily now? Margaret intervened, recognizing the urgency in Abigail's tone. Something's wrong. Come on, all of you. As the girls hurried upstairs, Abigail retrieved the shotgun from above the fireplace. It was loaded, she had checked earlier, but she had never fired such a weapon before. Her experience with firearms was limited to the small pistol James had insisted she learn to use during the war when he was away and she was alone. Still, the solid weight of the shotgun in her hands was reassuring as she positioned herself by the window, watching the buggy pull up in the yard. Victoria Wellington was handsome rather than beautiful, with sharp features and calculating eyes that assessed the house as she brought her horses to a stop. She was perhaps 40, expensively dressed with an air of entitlement that was visible even at a distance. Martin helped her down from the buggy with a gallantry that seemed at odds with his character, as Abigail had experienced it. Together they approached the house, Wellington carrying a large basket covered with a cloth, Martin empty-handed, but alert, his gaze sweeping the property. The knock, when it came, was firm, authoritative. Abigail didn't answer, watching through the window as Wellington frowned and knocked again harder. Mrs. Thornton, the woman called, her voice carrying clearly. It's Victoria Wellington. I've brought some things for the girls as I promised. Abigail remained silent, the shotgun ready, but hidden behind the curtain. After a moment, Wellington turned to Martin, saying something Abigail couldn't hear. Martin responded with a shrug, then moved to peer through the window on the other side of the door. His face, distorted by the uneven glass, was nevertheless recognizable. He cupped his hands around his eyes to block the glare scanning the interior of the house. When his gaze landed on Abigail, a slow, unpleasant smile spread across his features. He said something to Wellington, who stepped back from the door with a look of annoyance. After a brief consultation, Martin moved to the side of the house, disappearing from Abigail's view. Wellington remained on the porch, setting down her basket and adjusting her cloak with an air of someone prepared to wait. Abigail moved quickly to the kitchen at the back of the house, arriving just as Martin appeared at that window. He saw her watching and made an exaggerated motion of trying the window latch. Finding it secured, he frowned, then moved out of sight again. This was a coordinated effort. Abigail realized, Wellington at the front, Martin testing for weaknesses at the back. What did they want? William had taken the box with the map and key, but perhaps they didn't know that. Or perhaps they had other motives entirely. The thought had barely formed when a new sound reached her, the splintering of wood. They were forcing their way in through the back door. Abigail raised the shotgun, aiming it at the door. I'm armed, she called out, pleased that her voice remained steady despite her racing heart. The sheriff has been informed of your threats, Mr. Blackwood. He's expecting William's report about your role in Rebecca's death. The splintering stopped. After a moment, Martin's voice came through the door, smooth as oil. Now, Miss Parker, there's no need for unpleasantness. Mrs. Wellington and I are merely concerned for the children's welfare with their father away so soon after that terrible fire in town. The children are fine, Abigail replied coldly, and they will remain so if you leave immediately. You're being quite unreasonable. Wellington's voice joined in coming from the doorway that connected the kitchen to the main room. She must have entered while Abigail was distracted by Martin. I've only come to deliver some clothing for the poor motherless creatures and to discuss a proposition that would benefit everyone. Abigail turned, keeping the shotgun leveled now at Wellington, who stood with remarkable composure given the weapon pointed at her chest. What proposition would that be, Mrs. Wellington? Abigail asked, edging sideways to keep both the back door and the banker's widow in her field of vision. Wellington smiled, a practiced expression that didn't reach her eyes. A simple one. The Thornton girls need a mother, a real mother, not a hired help playing at the role. They need education, society advantages I can provide. She adjusted her fur-trimmed cuff. And William needs a wife of appropriate standing, not a transient woman with questionable background. The insult stung, but Abigail kept her expression neutral. And I suppose you've generously offered yourself for this position? It's the sensible solution, Wellington replied with a dismissive wave. William will see that once he's thought it through, especially when he considers the alternatives. Alternatives, Abigail prompted, hearing the threat beneath the smooth words. Times are hard for a man with 6 daughters and a ranch barely breaking even, Wellington said. The bank holds the mortgage on this property, you know. And as Henry's widow and the majority shareholder, I have some influence over such matters. Ah, there it was, the true motive. Not just the desire to bed William Thornton, but to acquire his land through marriage or foreclosure. And Mr. Blackwood, Abigail asked, gesturing toward the back door with the shotgun. What's his interest in this generous arrangement? Wellington's smile thinned. Martin has a legitimate claim to certain property that belonged to Rebecca's father. William is being unreasonable about it, influenced no doubt by his grief and other factors. Her cold gaze raked over Abigail. Once we're married, I'll help him see reason on that matter as well. I see, Abigail said, understanding now the unholy alliance between these two. Wellington wanted the ranch and William. Martin wanted the mine. Each was using the other to get what they desired. But there was one thing neither of them knew. William already had the box, the map, and the key. He was already on his way to the sheriff with Sophie's testimony about what she had witnessed the night of the fire. A creak from the back door reminded Abigail that Martin was still there, still a threat. She needed to keep Wellington talking to stall until William returned, or until she could think of a way to drive them both off. And if I refuse to leave, if William refuses your proposition, she asked. Wellington's eyes hardened. Don't be naive, Miss Parker. A woman in your position has few options. No family, no property, no standing in this community. She gestured around the kitchen. This isn't your home. These aren't your children. William isn't your husband. What claim do you have here, really? The words struck at Abigail's deepest insecurity, the fear that she was merely a temporary fixture in the Thorntons' lives, that her growing attachment to the girls, to William, was presumptuous and one-sided. But then she thought of Sophie's certainty that she was the golden-haired angel Rebecca had foreseen, of Margaret's grudging acceptance, Hannah's quiet confidences, Victoria's drawings, Charlotte's eagerness to learn baking, Emily's constant chatter, of William's eyes when he'd said, "When I return, when this is finished." "Love," she said simply. "I love them. All of them." Wellington's expression flickered with genuine surprise before settling back into contempt. "Love," she scoffed, "a luxury for the secure. What these children need is stability, position, opportunity. What they need," came a small, clear voice from the doorway, "is someone who doesn't smell like lies." Abigail turned to see Sophie standing there, her scorched shawl around her shoulders, her sisters arrayed behind her like a protective wall. Margaret stood tallest, her arm around Emily's shoulders. Hannah held Victoria's hand while Charlotte clung to Margaret's skirt. "Sophie?" Abigail said urgently. "All of you go back upstairs." But Sophie stepped forward, her gaze fixed on Wellington with an uncanny intensity. "You're the one who gave the bad man the matches," she said accusingly. "I saw you. In town. The day Mama died." Wellington's face drained of color. "What nonsense is this, Martin? Are you hearing this?" The child is clearly disturbed. But Martin had gone silent behind the back door. The only sound was the crunch of snow underfoot as he apparently retreated from his position. Sophie continued, her voice steady despite her youth. "You were in the store. You gave him matches and something in a bottle. You said, make sure it looks like an accident. Wellington's composure cracked. You wretched little liar, she hissed. You couldn't possibly remember such a thing. You were 3 years old. Sophie remembers everything, Hannah said quietly. She always has. Like when you came to dinner last summer and put something in Pa's coffee when you thought no one was looking. Sophie saw you. And when you told Uncle Martin where Pa kept the spare key to the house. Margaret added her young face hard with accusation. Sophie heard you. Wellington's gaze darted between the girl's calculation and fear warring in her expression. This is absurd, she said, but her voice had lost its authoritative edge. Martin, we're leaving. Now, but Martin didn't respond. The sound of a horse galloping away reached them. Instead, Martin Blackwood had abandoning his accomplice at the first sign of trouble. Wellington's face contorted with fury. Coward! She spat toward the back door. Then, gathering what dignity she could muster, she turned to Abigail. Lower that shotgun, Miss Parker. I'm leaving. I think not, came a new voice, deep male and crackling with barely controlled rage. William Thornton stood in the doorway to the main room, his rifle trained on Victoria Wellington. Behind him, Sheriff Davis and another man Abigail didn't recognize watched with grim expressions. Victoria Wellington, the sheriff said formally, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and arson. Martin Blackwood has already confessed to setting the fire that killed Rebecca Thornton and to your role in planning it. Wellington's face went from pale to ashen. He's lying, she insisted. I had nothing to do with it. It was all Martin's idea, his obsession with that mine. Maybe so, Davis acknowledged. But we have witnesses who saw you with him the day of the fire, including little Sophie here. And we have this. He held up a small bottle. Found it in Blackwood's saddlebag when we caught him trying to flee town. Kerosene with your fingerprints all over it, I'd wager. As the sheriff and his deputy led Wellington away, her protests fading into the winter air, William crossed the room to Abigail in 3 long strides. He took the shotgun gently from her hands, setting it aside, then pulled her into an embrace so fierce it nearly lifted her off her feet. You're safe, he murmured into her hair. All of you are safe. Abigail clung to him, the release of tension making her knees weak. How did you know to come back? She asked when she could speak. How did you catch Martin? William eased back to look at her, his hands still on her waist. I didn't make it to town, he explained. About a mile out, I met Davis and a posse heading this way. Seems Martin got drunk in the saloon last night after the fire and started boasting about how he'd handled Rebecca when she wouldn't give him what he wanted. Said it was almost too easy to make it look like an accident. Someone reported him, Abigail guessed. William nodded. The bartender. He served with Rebecca's father in the war. Couldn't stomach hearing the man's daughter spoken of that way. His expression darkened. By the time I met them, they'd already arrested Martin. He broke immediately, blamed everything on Victoria. Said she'd been after the ranch for years, saw Rebecca as an obstacle, and me as a means to an end. She wanted to marry you, Abigail said, unable to keep a hint of possessiveness from her voice. William's mouth quirked in a half-smile. So I gathered. Seems I've been the object of a rather cold-blooded courtship. Not just by her, came Margaret's voice reminding them they weren't alone. All 6 girls were watching this exchange with varying degrees of interest and amusement. William cleared his throat, releasing Abigail with obvious reluctance. Right, well, that's a discussion for another time. He turned to his daughters, crouching to gather the younger ones close. You were all very brave today, especially you, Sophie. Sophie beamed under his praise, then looked to Abigail. The angel kept us safe, just like Mama said. William followed her gaze, his expression softening as he looked at Abigail. Yes, he agreed quietly, just like Mama said. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Martin Blackwood and Victoria Wellington were held in the town jail in Enola awaiting transfer to the territorial prison for trial. William met with lawyers about the mine deed and the key to Thomas Lowry's desk, which was indeed found to contain detailed maps of the richest gold veins. The story of Rebecca's murder and the conspiracy behind it spread through the valley like wildfire, transforming the Thornton family overnight from objects of pity to subjects of fascinated respect. Neighbors who had kept their distance after Rebecca's death now called regularly, bringing food and offers of help. Through it all, Abigail maintained the household with steady hands, providing the girls with the structure and reassurance they needed amid the upheaval. She said nothing about Theodore's letter or California waiting for William to raise the subject, as he had promised. He did so on a clear, cold evening in late February when the girls were asleep and the house was quiet, save for the crackling of the fire in the parlor. Abigail sat in her usual chair, mending one of Emily's dresses when William entered from his study, a document in his hand. "I received this today," he said without preamble, holding out the paper to her. "From Josiah Bennett, Rebecca's father's lawyer. It's about the mine." Abigail set aside her sewing and took the document. It was densely written in legal language, but the essence was clear enough. Thomas Lowry's gold mine, long thought worthless due to flooding, was now estimated to be worth a small fortune with the discovery of his hidden maps. As Rebecca's widower and the legal guardian of her children, William would control this inheritance until the girls came of age. "This changes everything for you," Abigail said, handing the paper back. "For the girls, you'll be able to give them every advantage." "Yeah," William agreed, taking a seat opposite her. "Education, travel, security. Everything Rebecca would have wanted for them." He paused, studying her face. "It also makes certain things possible that weren't before." Abigail's heart quickened. "What things?" "This, for one." William reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. From it, he produced a ring, the simple gold band set with a single pearl. "It was my mother's," he explained. "I've been carrying it for days, waiting for the right moment." Abigail stared at the ring, then at William's face, hardly daring to believe what was happening. "I'm not good with words," he continued, his voice rough with emotion. "Not like Rebecca was. But I know what I feel, Abigail, what the girls feel. You've brought life back to this house, light back to our days." He took a deep breath. "I love you. We all do. And if you can find it in your heart to stay, to make this broken family whole again." "Yes," Abigail whispered, tears blurring her vision. "Yes, William, I'll stay." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into his arms. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a promise of deeper passion to come. When they broke apart, Abigail rested her forehead against his, overwhelmed by the journey that had brought her to this moment. "What about Theodore?" William asked after a moment. "California." In answer, Abigail reached into her pocket and withdrew the crumpled letter and train ticket. Without hesitation, she tossed them into the fire, watching as the flames consumed them. "My place is here," she said simply. "With you, with the girls." William's arms tightened around her. "Rebecca knew," he murmured. "Somehow she knew you would come, that you would save us all." "Not just me," Abigail corrected gently. "She saved you too in her way. Through Sophie, through her foresight in hiding the box." She touched the pearl on her new ring, glowing softly in the firelight. "I think perhaps she would be happy for us." "I know she would," William agreed. "She always put the girls' happiness first, and they adore you." As if summoned by their parents' words, a small figure appeared in the doorway. Sophie, her scorched shawl around her shoulders, her eyes heavy with sleep. "Sophie," William said, rising to go to her. "What are you doing up so late?" "I had a dream," the child explained, rubbing her eyes. "Mama was in a garden picking flowers. She was smiling." Sophie looked at Abigail. "She said, 'Tell the angel thank you.'" Abigail crossed to kneel before the little girl, gathering her close. "And we thank her too," she whispered, her eyes meeting William's over Sophie's head. "For everything." Later, after Sophie had been tucked back into bed, William and Abigail stood on the porch, gazing at the star-filled sky. The bitter cold of deep winter was giving way to the first hints of spring, a subtle warming in the air, a certain quality of light during the days. "We'll marry in April," William set his arm around Abigail's waist, when the snow melts and Rebecca's lavender starts to come up. "In the garden," Abigail agreed, leaning into his solid warmth, "with all the girls as our attendants." They stood in companionable silence, watching their breath form clouds in the night air. From death had come life, from ashes had bloomed new hope. The past would always be with them, James and Sarah, Rebecca, but the future stretched before them now, full of promise. "Look," William said softly, pointing to a fallen star streaking across the darkness. "Make a wish." But Abigail only smiled, her heart too full for wishing. Everything she could have asked for was already here: a home, a family, a love built from the ruins of grief. From the ashes of their separate losses, something beautiful had bloomed. And in the gentle Montana night, beneath a canopy of stars, that was more than enough. The end.